Start na.
Okay na.
Oo.
Good evening, Ma'am Beth. Good evening, Banatao people. We are the batch 3 of Physical Science, and tonight we are going to discuss our chosen questions and topic. Ara, I have here the members of batch 3.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Isa Fundal.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jenielle Calonia.
I'm Micah Berroya.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Christine RABULAN.
And I am Shaira Faye Comeque.
Hello, I'm KIARA SOSANGYO.
Hi, I'm Claire Angeles.
Hello, good evening everyone. I'm Francesca Prasaya.
Thank you. Now that you all met the members of batch 3, we're now going to our discussion. Ara,
So, good evening, Ma'am Beth, and good evening, Banatao people. I'll be answering what is the difference between solubility and miscibility. The solubility is a more general term, but it is more often used to mean the ability of a solid solute to dissolve in a liquid solvent, while miscibility is used when talking about the solubility of specifically liquid solutes. Solubility is the property of solid, liquid, or gaseous chemical substance called solute to dissolve in a solid or liquid gaseous solvent to form a homogeneous solution of the solute in the solvent. The solubility of a substance fundamentally depends on the used solvent as well as the temperature and pressure. The extent of the solubility of a substance in a specific solvent is measured as a saturation concentration, where adding more solute does not increase the concentration of the solution. For example, if I have 100 grams of water in the temperature of 30 degrees Celsius and add 10 grams of sugar, what will happen? The sugar will be dissolved. Now, if I add 10 more grams of sugar to the mixture, some of the sugar settled at the bottom because it is too much for the solution. This solution is called saturated solution. In miscibility solution, there are two substances, the miscible and immiscible. Miscible substances is fully mixed in all proportion. For example, the water and alcohol. While immiscible substances never fully mix in any proportion. For example is the oil and the water. Ara,
Define polar substance and nonpolar substance. So, polar substances can be defined as chemical species consisting of two or more atoms held together by covalent bonds that are polar due to the unequal sharing of electrons. In terms of solubility and miscibility, polar substances can only be dissolved or mixed with polar substances. So, polar to polar. What makes a bond polar? A bond between two or more atoms is polar if the atoms have significantly different electronegativities. Polar bonds do not share electrons equally, meaning the negative charge from the electrons is not evenly distributed in the molecules. Water, hydrogen fluoride, and ethanol are examples of polar substances. Nonpolar substances or nonpolar covalent bond is a type of chemical bond that is formed when electrons are shared equally between two atoms. The reason why a nonpolar bond is also termed a covalent bond is that the difference in electronegativity is mostly negligible, meaning there is no separation of charges between two atoms or both the atoms have the same electronegativity. Examples of nonpolar substances are oxygen, nitrogen, and ozone.
What is covalent bond? Covalent bond is a chemical link between two atoms or ions in which the electron pairs are shared between them. These electron pairs are known as shared pairs or bonding pairs, and the stable balance of attractive and repulsive forces between atoms when they share electrons. Ara? So, there are two important types of covalent bond na nasabi kanina, ulitin ko lang. First, polar covalent bond is a type of chemical bond where a pair of electrons is unequally shared between two atoms, while nonpolar are a type of bond that occurs when two atoms share a pair of electrons with each other. Ara?
So what are the types of intermolecular forces of attraction? Give examples. So first, intermolecular forces of attraction or IMFA. These are the forces that motivates molecule to attract to each other. Ito yung mga forces na nag-uudyok sa mga molecules na ma-attract sa isa't isa. Ara? So merong iba't ibang types ang IMFA. So number one dito is London forces. It attracts all substances for nonpolar molecule and noble gases. So example dito is oxygen gas, nitrogen gas, and helium gas. So ang nangyayari dito, for example, meron kang dalawang atoms and may protons and neutrons sa gitna ng atom. And then may electrons na nakakalat around it. Electrons move. Sometimes the other side is positive electrons while the other side contains negative electrons. Now the positive side attracts the negative side. It makes the London forces. And also London forces is the weakest type of IMFA. So next one is dipole to dipole or dipole to dipole forces. It it is polar molecule. Example dito is water. So water is considered as polar molecule because the electrons of it is not evenly distributed. May mga part na slightly positive and slightly negative. Therefore, there's a dipole. The portion that is slightly positive attracts the negative side. That is also the reason why water droplets are round. So, yung nafo-form sila na nagkakapit-bisig yung mga atoms and nafo-form sila na bilog and napo-form yung water droplets. So next forces is hydrogen bonding. Polar molecule containing H chemically bonded to small and highly electromagnetic non-metal atoms. Example na dito is ammonia. So simply, hydrogen bonding attracts the hydrogen molecule. It is also the strongest bond among the types of IMFA. So, for example, yung ammonia. Ang chemical symbol ng ammonia is NH sub 3, while the chemical symbol for water is H sub 2O. Na-attract ng ammonia yung hydrogen na symbol ng water. That's all. Thank you, Ara.
So I'll be discussing the differences between polar and nonpolar molecules.
The two main classes of molecules are polar molecules and nonpolar molecules. Some molecules are clearly polar or nonpolar, while others fall somewhere on the spectrum between two classes. Polar bonds have high melting point, surface tension, boiling point, and low vapor pressure. Polar molecules interact with other polar substances. These molecules have positive and negative charges on the opposite ends, while nonpolar bonds have low melting point, surface tension, boiling point, and high vapor pressure. Nonpolar molecules do not interact with other nonpolar substances and does not have profusion of charges at opposite ends. In simple terms, polar means oppositely charged and nonpolar means equally charged.
Ara,
Explain electromagnetic spectrum. The electromagnetic or EM spectrum is the range of all types of EM radiation, and radiation is an energy that travels and spreads out as it goes. An example of these are visible light that comes from a lamp in your house and the radio waves that come from a radio station. Ara, what you see in the picture are the types of EM radiation. And that wiggle thing line are what we call the wavelengths. The first and has the longest wavelengths of all is the radio. The second one is microwave. Third is infrared, and fourth visible. Fifth ultraviolet. Sixth X-ray, and that has the shortest wavelength is the gamma ray. But in terms of energy, gamma ray has the highest, and radio has the lowest. Ara.
So who is Thomas Young? Thomas Young, born June 13, 1773, Milverton, Somerset, England, and he died May 10, 1829, London, England. He is an English physician and physicist who established the principle of interference of light and thus resurrected the century-old wave theory of light. He was also an Egyptologist who helped decipher the Rosetta Stone. Thomas Young double slit experiment. In 1801, he performed an experiment that strongly inferred the wave light like nature of light because he believed that the light was composed of waves. Thomas Young reasoned that some type of interaction would occur when two light waves met. Ara,
What is interference? What are its types? Cite an example. Interference of light is the phenomena of multiple light waves interfering with one another under certain circumstances, causing the combined amplitudes of the waves to either increase or decrease. A major example of this is two bubbles colliding or exploding with each other. When the bubbles collide and they combine, the multiple light waves also combines and form another amplitude of waves that that increases, and that's what we call the constructive interference. And when two bubbles collide, then they pop or explode, they cancel each other's lights out, and that's what we call the destructive interference. Ara. These are the two types of interference, the destructive and the constructive interference. Constructive interference, like I said earlier, when two waves of identical wavelengths are in phase, they form a new wave with an amplitude equal to the sum of their individual amplitudes. The destructive interference happens when two waves of identical wavelengths are not in phase. They either decrease each other's amplitude or they completely cancel each other out. Ara?
Many people use the phrase every dark cloud has a silver lining to explain that around every negative experience one can find good or benefit from it. Little did they know that the silver lining observed around the cloud that is positioned as in front of the sun is caused by diffraction. What is diffraction? Cite an example. Diffraction is a slight bending of light as it passes around the edge of an object or an obstacle. If the opening is greater than the wavelength of the light, the diffraction is unnoticeable. On the other hand, if the two are closer in size or equal, in other words, the opening is less than or equal to the wavelength of light, the diffraction is easily to be seen or noticeable. In visible light, red has the longest wavelength which is diffracted the most, and violet has the shortest wavelength which diffracted the least. Each color bends at different angles. In conclusion, the relationship between the wavelength and the light diffracted is directly proportional. The longer the wavelength of the light, it diffracted the most. According to the Gasico.com, there are two types of diffraction, Fren- Fresnel diffraction and Fraunhofer diffraction. Fresnel diffraction is when the light from the point source reaches the obstacle and The waves produced are spherical and the pattern observed is the French image of the object, while Fraunhofer diffraction is when the waves from the light source are in the form of waveforms and they are infinite. The pattern observed is French image of the source and in a particular direction. Ara.
Okay, the next one is what is dispersion and cite an example. Do you ever see a rainbow, like a multicolored arc? If yes, allow me to discuss how the rainbow made. A rainbow is made of what we call dispersion. Dispersion is the spreading of white light into its fullest spectrum of wavelengths. We all know that the light coming from the sun is a white light. This white light consists of seven colors, namely red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, or the acronym RGB. A rainbow is generally formed when the sun appears just after the rain. So after umulan, may mga droplets na nasa air pa din or mga ambon on a simple word. When the sunlight when the sunlight passes through water droplets in the atmosphere, the water droplets acts like a small prism. As soon as the sunlight enters into a prism or a droplet, it splits into its constituent seven colors or the RGB itself. When this band strikes the other edge of the drop, it will form the arc shape of the rainbow. And after that process, we can now able to see the rainbow in our sky. It occurs whenever there is a process that changes the direction of light in a manner that depends on the wavelength or refraction. So gaya nga ng sabi ko kanina, it occurs lang kapag nagkaroon ng process ng pagbabago sa direction of light. And when it comes to wavelength naman, the red, orange, yellow have a longer wavelength compared to the green, blue, indigo, and violet. However, dispersion of light not only results in the formation of the rainbow. We can see it in our daily lives, like, for example, the water fountain, soap bubbles, and a simple CD. Ara?
What is scattering? Cite an example. Scattering is a change in direction of motion of particles caused by collision with another particle. It occurs when particles or large gas molecules present in the atmosphere interact with and cause the electromagnetic radiation to be redirected from its original path. The amount of scattering takes place depends on the several factors including the wavelength of the radiation travels through the atmosphere. Ara. There are three types of scattering, namely Rayleigh scattering, mass scattering, and non-selective scattering. Rayleigh scattering, also known as selective scattering, occurs when the particles are very small compared to the wavelength of the radiation. These could be particles such as small specks of dust or nitrogen and oxygen molecules. Next is mass scattering. It occurs when the particles are just about the same size as the wavelength of the radiation. Dust, pollen, smoke, and water vapor are common causes of mass scattering, which tends to affect longer wavelengths than those affected by Rayleigh scattering. Mass scattering mostly occur in the lower portion of the atmosphere where larger particles are more abundant and dominates when cloud conditions are overcast. Lastly, non-selective scattering occurs when the particles are much larger than the wavelength of the radiation. Water droplets and large dust particles can cause this type of scattering. Non-selective scattering gets its name from the fact that all wavelengths are scattered equally. This scattering causes fog and clouds to appear white in our eyes because blue, green, and red light are scattered equally, resulting white light. Ara.
So to sum it all up, here are the key points to remember. Solubility is a more general term, but it is more often used to mean the ability of the solid solute to dissolve in a liquid solvent. The next, miscibility is used when talking about solubility of specifically liquid solutes. Polar substance is a chemical species consisting of two or more atoms held together by covalent bonds. Nonpolar substances is a type of chemical bonds that is formed when electrons are shared equally between two atoms. Covalent bond is a chemical link between two atoms or ions in which the electron pairs are shared between them. Lastly, polar molecules occur when two atoms do not share electrons equally in a covalent bond. Ara?
The next one are intermolecular forces of attraction or IMFA, are the forces that motivate molecules to attract to each other. Nonpolar molecules or the electrons are evenly distributed. The electromagnetic or EM spectrum is the range of all types of electromagnetic radiation. Thomas Young is an English physician and physicist who established the principle of interference of light and thus resurrected the century-old wave theory of light. Ara?
Interference of light is the phenomena of multiple light waves interfering with one another under certain circumstances, causing the combined amplitudes of the waves to either increase or decrease. There are two types of interference, which is constructive interference and destructive interference. Diffraction is a slight bending of light as it passes around the edge of an object or obstacle. There are two types of diffraction, namely Fresnel diffraction and Fraunhofer diffraction. Dispersion is the spreading of white light into its full spectrum of wavelengths.
And the last one, scattering is a change in direction of motion of particle caused by collision with another particle. So here are the types of scattering: the Rayleigh scattering, Mie scattering, and non-selective scattering. Ara? And that's the end of our reporting. Again, we are the batch 3. Thank you for listening.